What's up, everybody? So recently I've been approached by Spaced Out Samples, and they were kind enough to give me all of their packs to see if I could do something interesting with their sounds in Psytrance. Turns out they have a lot of high quality stuff that can be used by loads of producers in any genre of music, really. Now, when I first received the packs, I noticed they were not specifically made for Psytrance, but this is actually what really sparked my interest. Just because the sounds are not specifically made for this genre, it doesn't mean that we cannot manipulate them and make them work in Psytrance. In a time where sample packs are bespokely tailored for the specific subgenres of music that they're selling for, knowing how to make your own sounds from simple, generic, or vintage sample pack sounds can actually be a game changer for your own sonic identity. So I figured this would be a great opportunity to show you guys how to make a great sounding Psytrance track using samples that are not specifically made for Psytrance. So without further ado, let's roll the intro and get right into it. Alright, let's get this party started. So this is the track that I made. It's just the intro first drop and then transition to the break. I used a lot of the spaced out samples. I'm going to play this from start to finish to you guys so you can listen to it, and then I'm going to go through everything that I did and how I manipulated all of the samples from Spaced Out. Alright, cool stuff. So let's go through everything that I did over here. This first group over at the top is the kick and bass group, and for this, unfortunately for the kick and the main bass sound, I cannot manipulate any of the spaced out samples to my liking, so I just ended up using my own samples. So this is my kick and my bass together. Cool stuff. However, I did use their samples for the layers, and the layers are a very important part, at least in my way of working, because I do like the layers on the top for the mids and the high mids and the highs to add a lot of attack and make it stick out on the mix when it's very dense during the middle section of the first drop or second drop and stuff like that. So for the first layer, you can see over here I did 3 of them, but the first 2, they come out of the same sample. They're just put in different octaves to fill out the spectrum a bit more. And the way I did this was I grabbed the Logic's Quick Sampler, and I just used one of the samples from the Bass Hits pack from Spaced Out, which is this one over here. And I used number 47, which is this one over here. So it's a pretty standard sound, but I really like all of the unison voices and the slight stereo information. It had a pretty well-defined attack too, so I just loaded the sample over here. I put the root key as C2 because the note is C. And you can see over here that I made it very short and plucky with the fade over here, and then the original sound is just like this. Right, so pretty simple. It just gives a nice attack and a pluckiness to the layer, and then obviously we have to cut the lows, but before that I actually used Infected Mushroom wider just to make the sound a bit more stereo present. Just a slight difference. And then I used the linear EQ over here, cut everything below 200 Hertz. I used mid-side processing, however, because I wanted to cut a bit more of the lows on the sides, just so it doesn't sound confusing and it doesn't lose focus on the 300 to 500 Hertz range. So on the sides, I cut it all the way to 500, and then I boosted the side signal an extra 3 dB on top of the wider that I added over here. And then the final result was this. Now by itself, I know it doesn't sound that impressive, but when we add everything together, you're going to see how much it adds. On the second layer, it was exactly the same processing. The wider and the linear EQ have exactly the same parameters, I believe. Yep. And the only difference over here is that I changed the octave of the root key over here. So I changed it to 1 octave below so that the phrase is 1 octave on top. So it will sound an octave higher. Right? And then both of these together, they just add a bit more to the spectrum. Just the first layer. And then with the second layer on top. So it just adds a bit more brightness to the sound as well. Now for the third layer, I used a different sample, and let me turn off all of the processing here and show you what I did over here. Same thing, I used the quick sampler from Logic, and I grabbed another bass shot sample. Now this bass shot sample is this one over here. You can see it doesn't sound like something you would use on a layer. However, the attack of this sound is very nice, very bright. So I decided to grab this sample and just make it very, very short. And then it just sounds like almost like a percussive piece over here. Let's hear that. Right, so it almost sounds like a percussion transient. But to spice things up, I just added an OTT over here, and the settings are like this. Everything is the same, except I took all the lows out. We don't need the low information for the layers, and the upward compression was brought all the way down to 0. I only used downward compression. And the result is this. Just makes it a bit more buzzy, a bit brighter. And then I did the same thing with the stereo information and cleaning up the frequencies. Infected Mushroom wider, 50%. And then a linear EQ, cutting the lows on the mid, bringing a bit of air on the top over here. And the same thing on the side, but bringing up by 3 dB and cutting a bit more of the low mids. And then it sounds like this. Now you may have noticed that the sound now has a lot more sustain. So to make it a bit tighter, I just used a noise gate. And on this occasion, I actually used the noise gate from Kilohertz. They make great stuff as well. So without the gate and with the gate. just a bit snappier. Now let me show you the difference that layers can make. So I'm going to play just the kick and bass without the layers for you guys. And now this is going to be the sound with the layers. It just adds character and attack, and it makes it stick out in the mix a bit more. So let's go to the drums over here. And on the drums, for the hi-hats, I used pretty much just the sample straight out of their packs and loaded them into Sitala, which is normally the drum machine that I like to use. And pretty simple stuff. I didn't change a lot of it. Everything was already like pretty well high-passed, and the levels were good. The only thing I did was on some of these samples, you see the shape is -70, and you can see this changes the amount of sustain and release that you have on the hi-hats. So I just use this to make some of the hi-hats a bit tighter. And these are the samples. So, you know, just great stuff. They're very high quality stuff that they have. And by the way, all the samples are 24-bit, which is great. I've seen a lot of Psytrance packs with all of their samples being at 16-bit, which, you know, it's not the end of the world, but at the same time, like, it doesn't take a lot more space, and it's always better to work with 24-bit, because when you throw it into your DAW, whether it's Logic, Ableton, or whatever, it doesn't matter what bit depth that the audio file you're going to throw in is at. Your DAW is going to convert to a PCM like WAV file and 24-bit, because this is how DAWs work. So there's always going to be a conversion to 24-bit anyways. 24-bit has a lot more dynamic range, and it might not be the end of the world for one sound, but when you pile up a lot of 16-bit files on top of each other, the noise floor goes a lot higher than if you would use the same samples stacked up with 24-bit. So it's very nice that they have 24-bit stuff. And then I just made a little pattern with the hi-hat. I don't think I changed the pattern across the song, so this is how it sounds by itself. Pretty simple stuff, but it sounds good. It works with Psytrance. And now let's go to the claps and snares. Now, this one's labeled snare and clap, but it's just snare, actually. So if I turn off all of the processing, I use these samples over here, which these first two are actually pretty simple, generic 909 samples that you can get out of any 909 or 808, really. They sound pretty standard and vintage, which is good, but in Psytrance you want to make the snares sound a bit different. They sound a bit different than snares that you would use in other genres of EDM. So this is how they sound by themselves. Right, so I don't think I ended up using the third one over here. I put them in a percussion machine, but these two, they sound a lot like a typical 909. They're not going to sound that great in a Psytrance track. I made the shape of this one a bit tighter just to hold the sustain, but what you can do with snares that sounds very good in Psytrance is throw an OTT on it, and on the OTT I just turn the upward compression down, the lows down, we don't need the lows, and then all of a sudden it sounds completely different. Let me show you. Lot better. And then after that, I just added a bit of overdrive just to get a bit more brightness and loudness overall. So just 6 dB of drive, I just compensated on the output. And then just some channel EQing just to shape the sound a bit more, cut all the lows out, took a bit of the frequencies between 300 and 500 off, and then added a bit of air to it. And this is how it sounds with all of the processing. Now let me show you without all of the processing again so you can listen to the difference. With the processing now. Now this sounds a lot more like a Psytrance snare. So this is always a good idea with Psytrance. You can use OTTs to make the snare sound a lot grittier and really just changed the timbre of it. Now, I still wasn't satisfied with the sound of the snare by itself, so I just added a clap layer, which also came from their packs. By the way, the snares came from the, let me look over here, the spaced out drum shots, and the claps and reverse clap also come from there. So this is the sample that I used for the clap. You see I made it tighter with a fade out. So it's a great snap sample that sounds very good when you layer it with a snare. And then I just accentuated second snare of each bar on the fourth beat of the bar with a reversed snap. It comes from a different sample, but it's still a snap sample. Right? So all three of them together sound like this. Great, so now for the perks. On the perks, I used the Citala as well, and I grabbed a bunch of percussion samples that are these ones over here. All of these samples came from the minimal percussion pack, as you can see over here. Right, so this is a great percussion pack that they have. It has loads of percussion sounds, 100 of them. Great stuff. So, and then I just created a little pattern that comes in with all of these percussions. So I just added a bit of distortion over here and a channel EQ to cut the lows and a little bit of a plate reverb to put some ambience on it. And then for the crashes, it comes from the drum shots as well. I just used one of their crash cymbal samples, and I added some channel EQ just to cut off all of the mids pretty much. Nothing below 2000 hertz is playing. Crash cymbals in Psytrance work very well when they're very low cutted, so you just go very high on the low cut. So then I just added some reverb and some delay to it. And this second track over here is the same crash cymbal but reversed, just to create some tension, and they sound like this together. The reversed crash doesn't have the delay just because it would clash with the delay that already comes from the crash hit, so that's it. And now we have the fill kit that I also used spaced out samples for. I grabbed a bunch of samples from the same pack, the drum shots pack, and grabbed the kick, a couple of snares, and 2 hi-hats. And they sound like this. Again, there's just a little bit of shaping over here on the kick to make it tighter. And then I used this for a bunch of fills over here. I did use some of my own fills to counterpoint this kit that I just showed you. But I also used one of these samples over here, which is this one, as kind of like a cinematic percussion hit during the drop on some parts over here. But you can see this section over here is a fill, and this is just to add something rhythmically to the drop section. So let me show you. Pretty simple stuff. So for the build-up snare, I also used one of their samples. This is a great snare sample that comes from their drum shot pack as well. And the only thing I did was just add a little bit of plate reverb and a bit of a hall reverb as well. And then I added a frequency shifter from kilohertz, which is great for, you know, doing pitch shift automation stuff. And you can see over here that I do some pitch shift automation and also some gain automation, as you can see over here, just to bring it up from the background to the foreground with automation. And this is how it sounds with both automations on. So yeah, and this is pretty much the drum section. For the impacts, I just used some of my own impacts as well, just because I like them so much. And then for the leads, most of the leads, Then for the leads, all of them were actually either synthesized by me over here, like as you can see on Serum, and or I used other patches from like retro synth from Logic and stuff like that. And the reason why I used mostly my stuff and you know, actual synths is just because I like to assign my leads to different macros and have modulation automation going on just to add a bunch of movement, and it becomes a lot harder when you have to use samples on a sampler, and you know, you can't do some sort of nuances for that. So for all of my leads, I actually just use my own stuff, but for the voices, they have some great packs for spoken word over here. There's spoken word 1 and spoken word 2. There's 50 samples on each, and they're literally this. They're just spoken word samples that you can use, and spoken word works fantastically on Psytrance. They add so much ambience to it. If you choose the right samples, they can create a lot of mystique and set up a theme for your track. So over here, if I turn off all of the plugins, you can see that it's just a normal spoken word thing from you know, some podcast or something.
But the weird thing about quantum mechanics is that there's a whole separate set of rules for what happens when you look at the thing.
Right, I just did some editing over here. But then what I like to do with spoken voices, especially when they're in the middle of a drop, is just to distort the hell out of it. So I used the Plugin Alliance yellow drive. You can see the level, drive, and tone are all the way up. And then I just clean it up over here, cutting the highs and the lows, boosting a bit of the high mids over here, and then it kind of sounds like it's coming out of a very distorted transistor radio, which is a pretty cool effect. Obviously, I added a little bit of plate reverb just to put it in a space, but this is how it sounds with everything on.
But the weird thing about quantum mechanics is that there's a whole separate set of rules for what happens when you look at the thing.
Right, it sounds really great when you put it in a drop. Now for the stretched voice over here, I actually just grabbed a sample, another sample from the spoken word package. I opened up Flex Time and I just grabbed the whole thing and I just stretched it out so that it sounds very slow and alien-like, right? And then I bounced it, and I added a bunch of effects just to add some character, like over here, the vocal transformer from Logic. Brought the pitch down by an octave and the formant up a little bit, and then it sounds a bit alien-like. And then your normal stuff, just some overdrive for distortion, cleaning up the highs and lows. And this LFO tool just moves the voice around in the pan on a very low rate over here of a bar. And then I added a stereo delay just to add a bit more space to the whole thing. And the final result is this. Very cool to have these on breaks and intros. It adds a very alien-like thing. And now for the reverse Fox, I just did your typical grab the syllable from one of the packs, added a bunch of reverb to it, brought it to 100%, bounced it, reversed it, and then EQ'd a lot of it to add a lot of air to it, and then you just have this reversed voice thing. And then gated Vox. So over here, I again grabbed one of these samples over here, but this one actually, it's a voice shot sample, but it came from the Synth Hits pack, I believe. Yeah, Synth Hits C4. Right, so I just brought this in, I looped it over, I transposed the pitch to match the key of the track, which is an F, so it's 5 semitones above, and then I added a bunch of things just to bring it up in volume and stuff like that and make it stand out in the mix, but I made it gated. And the way I made it gated was not with LFO Tool or Infected Mushrooms Gatekeeper. I actually used a noise gate that has a side chain to this gated Vox source channel over here, which just plays a clean, like, sawtooth. And then what happens is that the noise gate is controlled by the MIDI notes that I use over here. So now I have a lot more control over the rhythm that I can do. I can do a lot more syncopations. I can do variations very easily because the noise gate on the actual Vox track is just listening to this and opening up its gate when I play a MIDI note. So the vocals with the noise gate sound like this. Right, nothing too special. Now for the ambience group over here, oh, this one's off the group. Let me put it in. There you go. So for this, I use the atmospheres and textures pack from them. And I just loaded the textures into Serum on the noise section over here. As you can see, texture 1, and the same thing over here, texture 3. And then I just complemented that with a couple of spectral wavetables. Did a bunch of crazy filtering controlled by LFOs with a bunch of reverb and delay and stuff like that, just to make it very, very ambient. Now, the texture sounds by themselves, they're just recordings of outdoors and like vinyl crackles and stuff like that. So this is the one I used on BG1, which is texture number 1. You know, just a recording of a crowd or something, or a, you know, an airport. And then texture number 3 is actually a vinyl crackle sample. But if you put this on Serum and you do all this crazy stuff with loads of ambience, it just sounds like this. Then you add it to the second texture over here. And now you have a nice top layer for your pad sound. And then for the low pad over here is where the low frequency comes and the, you know, the weight of the pad is. When you add all of them together, they sound nice and big and ambient. And then, you know, I also assigned some of this stuff to the modulation, and I added some movement leading up to the first drop to create some tension and release tension as well. So for our last part over here, which is the effects, I actually had a lot of fun with this. I used pretty much only sounds from their packs, and you know, I just grabbed like little melody shots from the synth hits pack over here, and then I used some percussion from the minimal percussion pack or the spaced out drum shots. I also used some of the drum synths over here to create some grid effects and sci-fi drum shots as well. So let me show you some of the stuff that I did over here. This is a melody shot that I just I actually changed the timing because most of the samples on melody shots were on a BPM of around 120, so I had to speed it up a little bit, but these are some of these sounds. And this one over here is like an F major pad that I just reversed. Just did this, right? So I added a bunch of delay and stuff, and it's like a lead up sound to create tension. Melody shots number 2, I also had this one. You know, so the trick with these effects, especially when they are one-off effects, is just add a lot of ambience. You can see over here I have 2 reverbs on it and loads of delay. And this makes the sounds sound very big and atmospheric, and it creates a huge stage for your Psytrance tracks. Right, so like a percussion sample leading up to a synth shot, simple stuff like that. And then over here I had a very interesting thing as well, which was I used some of the robot bleeps from the Sci-Fi Drums Bleeps and Blops pack, and their WW1, which is the drum synths, and I just layered them together, reversed some of them, faded it out, cut it, and layered together, they kind of sound like this crazy robotic thing that's going on, like a Megatron, you know, transforming or something like that. And I just use this to switch between cycles over here. Right, and then over here you have these like percussion samples that I just chopped and sequenced. So yeah, just stuff like that. Over here, there's a little grid effects that I did with drum synths, and together they sound like this. I chopped and changed them a little bit, but I layer them, and then they create kind of like this grid effects sort of thing that is very typical in, you know, middle sections of drops in Psytrance. You know, just some crazy sounds to make it very psychedelic. And then lastly, for the uplifters over here, I actually didn't use the spaced out samples for that. I just used some of my own. And, you know, these uplifters are nothing special. They're just to create tension and switch between sections. This is pretty much it, guys. Great stuff. They have some great stuff. They are not specifically made for Psytrance, but if you know how to manipulate sounds, like I told you guys in the intro, you can create your own stuff. You can grab something that's more vintage, more generic, or really made for a different genre and shape it to make it fit in your own Psytrance tracks, and then all of a sudden you have a sonic identity. And it's also good practice to grab samples that are not exactly what you were looking for, but knowing how to manipulate them to make them sound exactly like you want them. As you just saw, I used simple 909 snare sounds with some creative processing to make them sound good in Psytrance. I used simple synth patches to create bass layers, ambient textures to create pads, and spoken word bits to create atmosphere on the track. I really hope this inspired you to use samples that are not specifically made for Psytrance to create your own sonic identity and be creative and create your own textures and atmospheres. And for me personally, working with the spaced out sample packs really opened my eyes on experimenting with different stuff, and I'm already using a lot of their stuff on current tracks that I'm working on. Now, if you like the spaced out sample packs, make sure you go check in the description below and click on the link that I put there if you are interested in buying these packs. As always, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, hit the bell notification, listen to my music, follow me on social media, and all of that jazz. So cheers, and see you on the next video.